Okay, how about now? Okay, it was a little bit delayed. All right.
Now we got it. Yeah.
All right. So we had a few little hiccups in the beginning, but now we're for sure live. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Yosine to once again. We had a few little hiccups. Yeah. To introduce me again. There was a small delay in the stream, but now we should be live.
Okay, so then hi everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Kunsthuis SYB YouTube channel, which we haven't been using very much, but we'll start using it again. And right now it's a great time to experiment doing a live stream for a final presentation due to Corona, and we all want you to be safe, so we figured we'd give this a shot. And giving this a shot is Sissel Marie Tonn, who has been our resident at SYB for the last 5 weeks, I think, where she started her project Becoming a Sentinel Species, and which she will be sharing through a live desktop collage, which she's been making. And it consists of, I think, interviews which you previously recorded, right? Some source materials, and we'll end with a bit of a Q&A, and we'll have some space for your questions as well. So if any questions occur, we'll have time at the end of the stream to answer those, and we'll have around 30 minutes for this presentation, so you know what to expect. Okay, take it away, Sissel.
Thank you. All right, second time's the charm. Thank you so much, Yosine, for the introduction and also for having me here at SYB. It has been absolutely a wonderful experience being here and getting the space, the mind space to think and really get started on this new project that I think is going to take me far into new directions in my own practice. And I just wanted to mention before I start how incredibly important I think spaces like this is in our current time. Being an artist is a lot of running around, juggling different things, trying to also stay creative while also being your own manager and bookkeeper and everything. So having those weeks of just being able to shut everything out and spend some time in wonderful Beetsterzwaag has been super pleasant for me and really important in this project. That being said, I'm really excited to, I'm going to share my screen, to be telling a little bit about this project called Becoming a Sentinel Species. It's the first time that I'm really sharing something publicly about the project, and it's really in the very developing phases right now. It's really about imagining the possibilities of entering a new field, which is environmental health and biomedical science in collaboration with art. Which is really exciting and also really, really daunting in a way. But backtracking a little bit, the project Becoming a Sentinel Species started with proposal that I created for the BAD Award, the BioArt and Design Award, which is an award that aims to bring together artists and scientists in tackling important questions of our contemporary society. And I was really lucky to be paired up with Heather Leslie, who is an amazing microplastics expert that we have here in the Netherlands, originally from Canada, and Juan Garcia Vallejo, who is an immunologist, also at the VU, and who's incredibly knowledgeable on this complex system that we're all thinking about right now, which is our immune system. And I was matched with these two incredible scientists during lockdown. So we met every Saturday night in each of our houses and talked for hours about plastic contamination and the possible effect that microplastics have on our immune system. Because Heather and Juan are working together to find out whether this microplastics that we have observed in our oceans for decades might also be appearing in our inner oceans. So we were discussing this. So this is, we have an animal here that is often susceptible to microplastics. We have some microplastics found in mussels here. We have a fish that also, you can see the microplastic beads. So I'll just bring those up. And I was really fascinated to learn that microplastics are beginning to appear in such small quantities inside our bodies that actually our immune cells are probably going to be able to attack them and to engulf them. And that was really fascinating to me. And of course, the fact that we were in lockdown and we were all very sort of worried about COVID-19 and what might, what might be happening, what kind of battles might be going on or not be going on inside of our bodies with this new virus, and also how we might hope that our immune system is well equipped and that we have the right profile in case we should get infected. That really, I think for a lot of people, made us think a lot more about the immune system and what might happen in the immune system. And these were really new thoughts for me. And at the same time, I was also reading a lot about the immune system and about how it's been thought of for a long time. And among other things, I was reading a book while I was discussing with Heather and Juan sort of what should we pitch for the BAD Award and how can we make an interesting artistic expression from this question of our immune cells encountering a piece of microplastics. And I was, for instance, reading the author Eula Biss, who has written an incredible book called On Immunity. And what stood out to me in this book, and this is Sentimental Medicine, is Harper's article that she wrote prior to the book. She's talking about us owing each other our bodies. And the book is really about vaccines, immunity and vaccines, as something that kind of goes beyond our bounded body, our sense of bodily self, and is completely dependent on our interactions and our collective bodies as a society. So I wanted to bring in, first of all, these quotes by Eula Biss. If we imagine the action of a vaccine, not just in terms of how it affects a single body, but also in terms of how it affects the collective body of a community, it's fair to think of vaccination as a kind of banking of immunity. And also the boundaries between our bodies begin to dissolve. Blood and organs move between us, exiting one body and entering another. And so too with immunity, which is a common trust as much as it is a private account. So Eula's work, as well as the work of, for instance, Mel Chen, who talks about the history, or who references the history of thinking of immunity going from something that was not necessarily a sort of personal account or something personal to the body, but something that was perhaps rather the immunity of a community, and towards it being something that you're almost responsible for yourself, the way that you can boost your immunity or that you can stay away from toxic people. So Mel Chan's book is about the animacy of toxicity as something that is not human, not animal, but something that is animating matter. And all of these accounts made me really interested in this question of how bodily self and what we consider immune self is somehow connected. Thinking also during the pandemic, of course, where we were staying inside and doing that in order to take care of more vulnerable populations, which really shows in a very tangible way how sense of self and immunity and collective immunity is connected. And that somehow tied in a lot with our conversations about pollution as well, about microplastics pollution that we've seen in the oceans for a long time. And we ended up getting to this concept of sentinel species. And sentinel species are species that environmental scientists monitor because they are immersed in a certain kind of environmental change, which then has some kind of detrimental effect on their well-being. And in that way, you can see that they have become affected by this pollutant or this toxicant. And so they're really like this kind of canary in the coal mine for other species. And I was fascinated in a way by this sort of instrumentalization of other species. And it resonated really well with the work of Alexis Shotwell, who's an American scholar who writes about what she calls purity politics, which is an idea of sort of adapting our lives in order to become less contaminated, less toxic, more pure, which you probably know there is a big industry around, of course, and for good reason, because increasingly there are more and more additives or pesticides or plastics added to our food, and we're starting to realize that the boundaries between what we think of as our body and the surroundings are getting more and more permeable and leaky as we realize the lead and the pesticides and all these different things. But for Alexis Shotwell, there is a danger to thinking that purity is an option, because as Annette Singh says, everyone carries a history of contamination, and purity is never an option. It's dangerous to think that you can become completely pure in that sense. I read in Alexis's amazing book Against Purity something about frogs and toads in a very contaminated area of Canada. And she says, the frogs are understood as being immersed in water, therefore in chemical soups, membranous, obviously, and the implication is, more than we are, experiencing what Nancy Tuana calls viscous porosity. Amphibians are framed explicitly as useful for telling us something about situations we cannot see or understand. Amphibians function here as an indicator species, which indicator species is the same as sentinel species, is not only human-centric and putting them in an instrumental relation. It is to a certain extent ignoring that they are their own beings in their own worlds, differently taking in the toxic load we create and distribute. This shows us something about the unequal distribution of toxicity. There are always bodies that are more exposed, more vulnerable, and more sensitive to toxins. Toxins show us that we are interconnected, but they also show the power structures of which bodies deserve to be clean. And this question of, this framing of looking at sentinel species as basically this hierarchy of which bodies deserve to be clean was really fascinating to me. And speaking with Heather and Juan during our conversations, I also realized that coming from an art and design perspective, I had sort of this desire of creating a project that would be a solution to microplastics pollution, where especially Heather was challenging me to think that you can also sometimes create what she called a techno fix or a bio fix for what is essentially a structural problem. So microplastics comes from a huge industry that's constantly getting bigger and bigger, and the problem cannot be solved once the plastic is in the oceans and or in our bodies and are breaking down over eternity. So with this in mind, we started thinking about, well, how can we then reframe the question in a way, reframe this idea of sentinel species, and think about what does it actually entail to become a sentinel species. And of course, that has to do with being sensitive to your environments and being this kind of canary in the coal mine. And perhaps rather than delegating this job to other bodies, what would it be like if we were the sentinel species, if anybody was a sentinel species, and really embrace this idea of contamination as a kind of spectrum, something that we're all implicated in. And that was sort of the starting point for the title for the work, which was Becoming a Sentinel Species. So how could we become a sentinel species? So yeah, that was kind of like the long introduction to the project. And from there, we started thinking of the way in which the immune system works. So I learned from Juan about a very interesting researcher who is called Polly Matzinger. And Polly Matzinger became really famous in the field of immunology because she was against this idea, or she was saying that the idea of the immune system being only bound up to cells trying to recognize self from non-self or self from foreignness was, it was incomplete. And according to her, the immune system is more concerned with damage or with danger than with foreignness, and it's called into action by alarm cells from injured tissues rather than by recognition of non-self. And I was really fascinated by that in terms of thinking of this idea of all these foreign objects being inside our bodies, but in a way it also ties back with the idea of immunity on a community scale or even on a planetary scale. And Juan sent me a text which was about how cells then recognize that there is danger, and I fell over one quote that I was really fascinated by, which was this one. So, because life evolved in water in the primordial sea, so it's sort of like the origin of all species, the hydrophobic portions of molecules are normally hidden in the internal parts of molecules or other structures like membranes, and the sudden exposure of a hydrophobic portion is a sure sign that some injury or damage has occurred. And having worked with the idea of hydrophobicity, especially industrially produced hydrophobic chemicals in previous projects, I was really fascinated by this kind of ancient memory of the body from the primordial sea. I'm just going to start this little film as well. And that the body has this kind of watery logic. We all know that we're this and this many percent water, and the fact that cells have then found out ways of hiding their hydrophobic tails, which you can see in this image where you see a cell membrane and the hydrophobic parts of the cell are hidden inside. And that this is somehow a kind of like immunological memory from that is as ancient as life itself was really fascinating to me. And it made me start to think of what other ancient memories would hydrophobic material that enters the body trigger or evoke. And so I'm going to put up this image as well of a hallucinating brain. This image of the hippocampus, which looks remarkably like a sea horse, and this image of the rubber hand illusion. So microplastics are highly hydrophobic. They have also the capacity of attracting hydrophobic chemicals such as PFOA. We had this hypothesis as we were talking about becoming a sentinel species that the ingestion of microplastics would trigger not only these ancient immunological memories of the body, of encountering the hydrophobic parts of a cell, but that they would also trigger hallucinations of returning to the primordial sea. And actually, the way that the immune system, I'm going to give a very, very, very simplified version of what we were focusing on in one part of the immune system, is that when the macrophages, which is sort of like the eating the Pac-Man cells of the immune system, encounters something that might be dangerous to the body, they engulf it and they send out these chemical signals called cytokines to the rest of the body. Some of it also goes into the brain, and if it goes on for too long, this alarm system, you can get this constant immunological danger response, which is incredibly damaging to the body in the long run. So you have constant inflammation, and that is actually also can actually also affect your cognitive function, your brain. And this kind of made us start talking about this relationship between our sense of cognitive self or our sense of bodily self in relation to our immunological self. And I realized actually that there has been some studies of the rubber hand delusion, which is a study that shows us how easily our sense of bodily self is tricked by, for instance, looking at a rubber hand that's being brushed at the same time as your actual hand is brushed. And that they also found out that when the mind thinks that the rubber hand is your real hand, immune system actually starts to create a histamine reaction in that in your concealed arm. So this sense, the cognitive sense of your bodily self is very closely actually connected with your immune self, which is really fascinating. So what we ended up imagining is a story in which microplastics have become so prevalent that they exist anywhere in water, but that there is a group of researchers that have found out that if they incubate their macrophages to send out the cytokines into the body, that they can sort of evoke the these hallucinatory memories of returning to the primordial sea. And through this process, we start to realize that water, our connection with the world as mediated through water, is actually a connection or an extension of our bodily self. So this is an idea that's, of course, really central in ecological thought, but also increasingly in the scientific community known as the One Health model. So the project will be an actual experiment. We're going to work with my blood, with my macrophages, and we're going to incubate them together with microplastics that we're going to find in the Waddenzee. So this is some sort of preview footage that I have shot together with the lab technician Malou van der Braber at the immunology lab at Vrije Universiteit. So it's a really it's the beginning of this project. It's really super fascinating to be part of a collaboration like this, but also to kind of speculate a little bit further. Of course, there is no real evidence that this hydrophobic portions of microplastics will actually trigger the immune cells this much. But it is an interesting hypothesis. So we're really kind of like working experimentally with that. And it's also really fascinating to work with Marloes in the lab and realizing this very close connection to anything fluid that is happening in the lab. There's a lot of swooshing of fluids and of injecting and extracting and things like that, which is really fascinating to look at. Of course, at this point, I'm really working on how to make this story, how to create the sort of whole, the whole world of this lab experiment and of this laboratory that will be my setting. And I have been working on creating these costumes that will almost be like casings or a house, like an environment for this encounter between the immune cells and the microplastics. And I have sort of been imagining creating artificial organs, which was very much inspired by animals that are actually also looked at a lot in immunological research, tunicates, which have an immunological link to humans and can therefore be used to better understand our immune system. And I've been working on ideas to think of, well, how would a speculative organ look like that would be able to create sort of like an ideal setting for human macrophages to meet and to ingest microplastics and send out these cytokines that trigger this hallucination. So I'm currently working on a lot of these sketches of how such an organ system might work, inspired also by, for instance, other artistic work. So these are from mediated matter labs that are working really speculatively on how we might think of wearables as these kind of like extended organs. Another sort of internet rabbit hole that I became fascinated with was a more sort of occult use of these kinds of pearls that I think are connected with the idea of gallbladder stones and things like this, but that has sort of like come out of animals, some kind of hard material that has been inside animals and have been extracted and then have sort of like an essence or like a strong spiritual power of that animal embedded inside of them. So for me, it's really a lot about how to really imagine the relationship between body and surrounding differently, and using this kind of imaginative, speculative story is helping me to do that. Okay, I think that was half an hour. There's a lot of information, so maybe, Jusine, if I bring you back, then we could also have a little discussion about some of the things that I showed, and probably some things you would like me to slow down a little bit and explain a bit further.
I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot.
Yes.
And it's so fascinating to see, and some things really struck me. I think the first thing that I really caught onto was the idea that I think your partner mentioned, like, yes, you could go in one direction and find a solution, or like a biological one-time solution, but that's not very interesting. Or could you tell me a little bit more about what it is then? Of course, I can imagine, finding a solution is more maybe also maybe the responsibility of scientists. So can you tell me a little bit more how you chose the other direction?
Yeah, definitely. So what we were, for instance, discussing was ideas of there are both research and artwork that are exploring this idea of bacteria being able to break down plastics, which is of course really fascinating that we can find that and that we can create this kind of like mitigating solution to this huge problem that we've created. But that can also be sort of a danger that lets off the polluters off the hook. And actually I had a conversation with Heather about beach cleanups as well, where we were discussing, beach cleanups are really great and important, but how did all this stuff end up there in the first place? And it is an issue. It is in a way an addiction to plastics that is happening much higher up in the production chain, that where things need, it's political decisions that needs, and it's regulation that needs to be changed, and we shouldn't take away the focus on that. So this idea of thinking of plastics as something that could create hallucinations, which in a way makes it a drug, I think is kind of interesting, because we get addicted to culture, we get addicted to cultural artifacts, they impact our brains. So we wanted to really make sort of like an active reference to that. And of course we might not tell something new about microplastics being bad, because I think a lot of people already know that, but when we're in Albert Heijn, there aren't much alternatives, but perhaps if we can sort of like tell different stories about it, it will also register on another level, I'm hoping.
So would it be interesting to you to make them scary, not by immediate reference, but just kind of insinuating that this is not really the way you want to go? Or is that,
I think,
could it be a horror story?
I think it will also be a pleasure story, because that's kind of like the complexities of these things that they've created, like super important developments for us as well, and they are extremely handy, but they're also forever, like they don't break down. So I think for me,
Sorry.
yeah, I mean, plastics are extremely durable, and once they're in an environment, they can stay there for thousands of years. That's kind of like the problem of these kind of materials, and it's also interesting because, yeah, very far back in the production chain, they're made from fossil fuels, so they're also connected to this like ancient decayed bodies of fossil fuel. So they have this kind of like long temporality. I know Heather Davis, who also writes a lot on plastics, she calls it the ultimate material of tempophagy, so time eating. And I think that's really interesting as well, that there is this kind of like long temporality of plastics that then in turn also trigger these ancient immunological memories of the primordial sea.
Yeah, speaking of those memories or those like hallucinatory effects, is that in any way related to existing science? Like, are there existing hallucinatory effects that are caused by your immune system, or is that a completely new direction that you're kind of speculating on?
I have found scientific articles that were talking about how kind of like chronic inflammation created by like this cytokine storm can create hallucinations and delirium in patients. But of course, I'm no scientist, so I don't know exactly how things are connected. But I was definitely interested also this experiment with the rubber hand illusion that I was mentioning, that there is kind of like a connection. Of course, I mean, we're one big organism, and everything is connected inside of us. So what happens to everything from here on and down is completely connected to our brains. And I think also when we're sick, we have weird dreams, right? So I think everybody knows like fever dreams are crazy. One other reference that I had was also a science fiction story from the 60s called The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, where the protagonists are experiencing, as the planet is heating up and it's almost like the environment is going back to the Cretaceous period, people are starting to also get hallucinations of like becoming reptiles. But in his story, it's kind of like a horrifying thing. It's like a terror, where I wanted to sort of think a little bit of like how might this spiritual connection with our origins in the primordial sea also be something that could help us realize that we are intimately connected with the surroundings that we are co-creating.
As in your intimate earthquake archive, or?
Yeah, I think that's something that I always come back to in my practice. I'm always really fascinated with where we believe our bodies to end and the environment around us to begin, and that's of course a knowledge that First Nations and Indigenous people have always known and still remind us of. So we're really indebted also to their scholarship and their knowledge.
Do you think there would be a way for us to return to that type of thinking?
I think so, and I think the more I think interconnectivity is like the big question of our times, and it's showing up constantly. Environmental, like climate sciences, environmental change, but also within the biomedical sciences, it's becoming more and more accepted that you need to cross over and be interdisciplinary in order to understand these complex, intricate networks that we're all embedded in. So I'm really super grateful to the BAT Award to be able to be at the center of this and work with such incredible researchers.
It's really an amazing project. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're taking it? Because you're now going to make a film out of this.
Yes.
Can you
Yeah.
walk us through the trajectory for this?
Yeah. So we're making this actual experiment with my macrophages and the microplastics, and that will become kind of like the script or the setting for a speculative film. Telling the story of these researchers who then end up hallucinating into the primordial sea. So that film will be shown, it will be premiered at MU in Eindhoven on the 11th of December. So very soon. And then hopefully afterwards, I would love to continue working on these topics through other artworks as well.
We'd love to see it.
Yes.
Do you think we got any questions through our YouTube live chat?
I can have a look. Doesn't look like it. Do you see any?
I can't see. I turned it off. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But that's okay. It's good to know that the film will be on view in December, which is fairly soon.
It is very soon.
Not to stress you out or anything.
No.
I can't wait to see it.
I will also update I will send you things to update the SYB Instagram. So you now, of course, while I've been at SYB, I've really been laying down the basics, doing a lot of sketches, lots of things out of clay, prototypes and things like that for the organs, and a lot of emailing as well. That's really like such a big part of a project like this, is just organizing and coordinating. But in the next coming months, it will really be like the making of everything. So I think that will be really exciting and fascinating.
That's so exciting. Any new directions that your project took while you were at SYB, or any new influences on your project?
Yeah, definitely. I decided to go for the super difficult route with these organs and work with the glass artist. So, of course, that will also give it this kind of like feel of the laboratory equipment, but kind of turning it a little bit and reminding viewers that what's happening in the petri dishes and in the incubators and things like that is a reflection of what happens inside the body. So I'm excited to be able to have these kind of like transparent, semi-transparent organs where, yeah, the battle, or I think maybe we should get away from the war metaphors of of the immune system, but the eating of microplastics by my macrophages will take place. So
it's very exciting. So I think we're good. We took it a little bit longer than 30 minutes, but I mean it's a
we
it's
also
a good
started.
story. It's a good story.
We started a bit later.
That's true.
So yeah.
What do you think?
New experiences in the post-lockdown times. I think it was really fascinating to be able to share the work in this format, and I hope
It was a very intimate look into your brain and into your practice. So that was very fitting, I suppose.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.